A question I get all the time from viewers is why don't we have more cute, cheap, fuel-efficient, fun-to-drive European vehicles in America? Well, there are a variety of different reasons for that, and we're going to explore some of them in this video. The first one, of course, is the classic reason. European cars are smaller because European roads are smaller. And while that is definitely true, there are some other reasons involved here as well. But size is certainly key, so let's talk about that first. The Renault Captur that I just spent 2 weeks driving across Italy is classified as a compact SUV in Europe in most countries. In America, however, we'd call it a subcompact vehicle. It's 162 inches long, so it's shorter than a Volkswagen Golf. It actually is right about the same size as something along the lines of a Kia Soul, which is definitely a solid subcompact in America. Remember that size classifications differ a little bit between North America, Europe, and other world markets. It had a 102.6-inch wheelbase, it's 162 inches long overall, and 70 inches wide, including the mirrors. And the Captur can feel a little bit big, especially in some of the urban situations that you may find yourself in Europe. The key takeaway here, however, is that the Captur is not an outlier in the European market. There are definitely a large number of vehicles that particular size. Let's take a look at the top 10 best-selling vehicles in Europe versus America. Obviously, in America, it's very pickup truck heavy. Right there towards the top, we have the Ram 1500, the Chevy Silverado, and of course, the Ford F-Series lineup. But we also have things like the Toyota RAV4, the Nissan Rogue, and of course, the Honda CR-V. Those seem like compact, practical little crossovers in America, but when we move those vehicles over to Europe, they end up feeling a little bit large. The only classified compact crossover on the top 10 sales list in Europe is the Volkswagen Tiguan, but remember, the Volkswagen Tiguan in Europe is actually a little bit smaller than the one that we find here. Now, it's not that Europeans don't like bigger vehicles. You can really see that in their shopping preferences. Over time, something like that Volkswagen Tiguan has climbed further and further up the sales ladder, but the list is also full of very compact, practical vehicles. It's also worth noting that the Volkswagen Golf is the best-selling vehicle in Europe, and for Europe, it is not terribly compact. It is sort of, think of it like the Toyota Camry of Europe rather than the Volkswagen Golf of America. Looking at the Volkswagen lineup, I think, is a good way to highlight some of the differences here. The Volkswagen Golf may be the smallest Volkswagen on sale in America, but it is not the smallest Volkswagen on sale in Europe. Most countries in Europe have 4 Volkswagen models that are going to be shorter in terms of overall length. We have the Up, the Polo, the T-Cross, and the T-Roc. All 4 of those are a little bit more compact than the Volkswagen Golf. Now let's talk about driving realities. I have driven all across Europe. I've driven in most of the EU countries, not quite all of them, but a decent percentage, about 20 of the EU countries overall. And one thing is definitely consistent. Lanes and parking spaces are going to, generally speaking, be smaller in Europe. Now, obviously, there are some exceptions. There are plenty of parking garages in newer suburban areas outside London or outside Paris, etc., that have more generously sized parking spaces. But in general, the lanes and the parking spaces are going to be considerably smaller. And that's going to be a big difference when trying to shoehorn a large American vehicle onto those roads. Now, you do see some gray market pickup trucks in some of the northern countries. Like, for instance, I've seen a strange number of Ram 1500s running around Sweden, but those are going to be a little tricky to park if you end up getting one into Stockholm. Minimum width standards for new parking spaces in America do vary by jurisdiction, but they have a pretty common theme here. Most cities and states say that parking spaces should be 8.5 to 9 feet wide and between 18 and 20 feet long, with the DOT standards saying that the spaces should be at least 19 feet long, but some municipalities will change that. Parallel parking spots generally are recommended to be 19 to 24 feet long, with most of the suburban parallel parking spaces being right around 24 feet long. That's a pretty big parking space. Compact parking spaces in America, those ones you'll find in malls where you have the tree and the planting right there in front of the parking spaces, those will generally come in right around 16 feet long, which is, interestingly enough, about the size of a long parking space in Europe. Europe, it's a bit more of a patchwork, but taking a look here at the laws, France and Spain allow spaces that are as narrow as 7.2 feet. And remember, in America, spaces generally be about 9 feet wide. So we're talking about 24 inches less overall parking space width. And for reference, a Volkswagen Golf, the most popular car in Europe, is 6.5 feet wide. So if you had Golfs parked next to one another in a 7.2 foot wide parking space, you wouldn't really have a lot of space to deal with. That's definitely something you'll find there in Europe. Older parking spaces can be even smaller across Europe as well. Recent guidelines from the UK appear to be the most generous in Europe right now. They're recommending that parking spaces should be about 7.9 feet wide, but only about 16 feet long, so still about 4 feet shorter than an American parking space. Also keep in mind lane width. So in America, lanes are 12 feet wide, really helping get that dually down the road if you want to. In Europe, they vary, but they can be as narrow as 8 feet 2 inches. That is a legal, allowed highway-style road with an 8-foot wide lane in it. That is pretty darn narrow. It's the size of that average parking space on the narrow side in America. Next up, we have business case reasons, of course. So European brands that don't sell vehicles in America at all, like Peugeot, Renault, etc., it would be difficult for them to gain a stronghold in America. They'd have to set up a dealer network, they'd have to start advertising here, they'd have to get their vehicles crash tested and certified for North American use. So obviously there's a big business barrier right there as well. But what about cars that are sold in Europe by brands that could logically bring them to America? Say, for instance, the Volkswagen Polo, the Volkswagen Up, things like that. Why don't they bring those cute little smart, efficient cars to America? Well, manufacturers have tried and they just don't sell well. Let's dive under the hood of the Renault Captur and see one of the reasons why. Even though some of the European vehicles that are on the top 10 selling list are sold in America, under the hood we find some very key differences between things like a Volkswagen Golf in America and a European Golf. So under the hood of this Renault Captur, for instance, we find a much smaller engine than you'd expect in America. This is a 0.9 liter 3-cylinder turbocharged engine. This produces 90 horsepower and just over 100 pound-feet of torque. Now remember, this is on the European horsepower scale, not an SAE horsepower number. And if this was rated in the United States, it would probably produce between 85 and about 88 horsepower or so. So significantly lower horsepower than we find in America. For 2020, the Captur has been redesigned and the base engine goes from 0.9 liters up to 1 liter 3-cylinder turbocharged, and that gives you just about the same kind of horsepower, just a little bit more and a little bit more torque than we find in this engine right here. If you want the most powerful engine under this hood, it's going to come in right around 150 horsepower if it was rated on the American scale, possibly about 170 pound-feet of torque or so. There are also 2 different diesel engines available in the new Captur. Neither of those would likely be able to come to America, of course, because of America's differing diesel regulations. The other big thing to know is that most of the engines are going to be mated to manual transmissions, and depending on the engine that you get in the Captur, like many of its competition in Europe, some of the engines are going to be mated only to a manual transmission, and that's also a key difference. The manual transmission in here is a 5-speed, not a 6-speed. That's still pretty common in Europe. At this point, you might be thinking, wow, that doesn't sound like a lot of horsepower. And in reality, it really isn't. But it's not unusual for Europe. There are more than 30 cars on sale in Europe today that will give you under 70 horsepower in their standard engine configuration. If we take a look at the US market, there are very, very few cars in America with under about 150 horsepower or so. We have the Mitsubishi Mirage at 78 horsepower. That is the least powerful car in America. It also is one of the lightest, however. Also is pretty cheap, and a lot of folks don't like it. Then we have the Toyota Yaris with its Mazda-derived engine at 106 horsepower. That is definitely sluggish for North America. Then we have the Nissan Versa at 122, and a number of other vehicles that are in that 120 to 150 horsepower range. For reference, going back to the Kia Soul that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, that gives you 147 horsepower standard. That's because acceleration standards are just different, and what people think of as a slow car versus a fast car is just different North America versus Europe. For instance, the Renault Captur, some of those other cars out there with under 70 horsepower, 13, 14, 15 seconds 0 to 60 is a pretty slow range for us in North America, but it's not abjectly horrible for a European customer. The Renault Captur, for instance, that we were driving is rated at 12.8 seconds, 0 to 62 miles an hour. It's going to be right around 12.2, 12 and a half, something like that, 0 to 60. So definitely on the slow side. Moving to America, however, 8.5 to 9 seconds seems slow. 11 to 12 seconds seems absolutely glacial. So there's definitely a different perception there when it comes to overall horsepower. Now, that's not necessarily related to overall speed limits because remember, the Autostrada in Italy has a speed limit of 130 kilometers an hour, about 80 miles an hour. If we go to Germany, there's the Autobahn, of course, which is speed unlimited in some sections, but recommended speed is right there at 81 miles an hour. And then there are plenty of 70 mile an hour or so speed limits right across Europe. So speed limits can be high, but not everybody is able to actually partake in those higher speed limits, because if you have a 50 horsepower car, it's going to be a little bit tricky to maintain 80 miles an hour on the autostrada. Now, why do we have the smaller engines there? Emissions, of course, is a key thing. Fuel economy is another key thing, and that's what we need to talk about next, is fuel economy. For instance, if we take a look at the fuel economy rating, which I happen to have right in front of me for the Renault Captur that we were driving, advertised number 78.5 miles per gallon in the diesel model, and now you're thinking, oh my God, why don't we have an 80 mile per gallon Renault on sale in America? Well, few things here. Let's discuss the gasoline fuel economy first. 55.4 mpg is what the Renault Captur that we were driving was rated for, according to the UK site. But this is where people get things a little bit wrong. Remember, the British gallon is larger than the American gallon. That is the key thing that a lot of folks don't realize. So that 54.4 miles per gallon translates down to 41.5 miles per gallon if you're talking about American gallons of gasoline. That doesn't sound quite as exciting. The next thing you need to know is that the European fuel economy test cycle is very different than the EPA test cycle. Now, a lot of folks give the EPA a hard time, but it is going to be a lot more accurate for real-world driving than the European test cycle. So, for instance, the vehicle that we were driving here, 5-speed manual, 0.9 liter gasoline turbocharged 3-cylinder direct injection engine, was supposedly rated for 41.5 American miles per gallon. We averaged just over 30 miles per gallon over 2 weeks of driving that car all around Europe, 30.1 miles per gallon overall. Now, that's not too bad, but it's definitely not 41 miles per gallon. At lower speeds, when we were not driving on the autostrada, so about the first 4 or 5 days we were just driving around country roads going about 45, 50 miles an hour, we got better fuel economy right around 35 to 36 miles per gallon, but still not the 41 mpg that we were quoted. Now, why is that? Because we're driving at higher speeds, we were driving it like a real person drives the car, and also air conditioning was used in that process. And air conditioning is something that's always going to drop your overall fuel economy. Now, that's not too surprising because the Renault Captur weighs about 2,600 pounds for the model that we were driving. So it's right in there, in line with something like a Kia Soul or some of those other subcompact, relatively efficient vehicles in America. Now let's talk about the financial realities. Remember that a small car is not necessarily that much less expensive to build than a larger car, because the cost of raw materials is not the only part that goes into making that vehicle bigger. So when we take a look at something like the Fiat 500, one of the smallest cars available in America, it doesn't necessarily have a price tag that is that much smaller than something like a Nissan Versa, which is notably longer in sedan format. The Fiat 500 starts at $16,495. And I think that's a really excellent vehicle to use as a practical comparison here. The Fiat 500 is considered a very small car in America. Now, in Europe, there are smaller cars available, but its price tag is not among the smallest. Also, in America, we get a 1.4 liter turbocharged engine that produces 160 horsepower as the base engine for 2020. For 2020, if you buy a Fiat 500 in Europe, you could get down to a 69 horsepower engine, because again, things like emissions, the cost of fuel, etc., all of that factors into a buying decision in both countries. Acceleration is absolutely positively glacial in that European Fiat 500. It's rated at 13 seconds, 0 to 62 miles an hour, about probably 12.8, 0 to 60, considerably slower than the North American model. For many Europeans, it's not that they want to go slow, it's that there is a true cost to buying a vehicle that is less efficient or has higher CO2 emissions. Remember that fuel is considerably more expensive in Europe than it is in America. Depending on where you're buying the fuel could be 2 to 3 times the price that we are paying right now in America. While I was running around in Europe, for instance, the gasoline costs ranged from about €1.50 to €1.75 per liter. And remember, the American gallon is 3.8 liters. It seems like the common wisdom is that small European vehicles aren't as good for taller drivers or taller passengers. But remember that Europeans are not necessarily shorter than Americans. In fact, the Dutch are the tallest people on Earth. And European vehicles are definitely designed with this in mind. We find seat tracks that definitely go a great deal rearwards versus a lot of subcompact vehicles that were designed specifically for American use. And versus something like a Corolla sedan or a Versa sedan, something that was definitely designed for America, we aren't going to find quite as much headroom. This seat is actually not all the way down on the ground. If I do move it all the way down there, then I have about 4.5 to 5 inches of headroom left. And we can, of course, move this steering column in quite far. So you can see this is definitely suitable for taller or bigger drivers. Now, wider drivers, that could be a little bit of a problem because European vehicles tend to be fairly narrow on the inside, as you'd expect, because you need to be able to park into a fairly narrow spot. I also think it's worth noting that the average European vehicle does not seem to be as designed for a really long road trip as American cars. That particular form of travel doesn't seem to be as common here. So in the US, you could hop in your vehicle in Houston, drive to Phoenix, and that would be 14 or so hours away. Just leaving Texas is 750 miles of driving out of Houston, and going 80 miles an hour, that's going to take you at least 7 hours just to leave Texas. It's going to be a lot of long, flat expanse. And these seats don't really seem to be designed with that in mind. Hopping into the back, it's easy to see why there's so many hatchbacks available in Europe. Because if you're going to be paying an awful lot for gasoline and parking is tricky, you don't want an inefficient shape like a sedan, you want a very efficient shape like a hatchback. So if I sit upright back here, my head is just barely brushing the ceiling. If I go all the way back to that headrest, there's definitely a reasonable amount of legroom back here. Now, I wouldn't necessarily describe this experience as overly roomy, but if you take a look at some of the European hatchbacks that make it to America, like the Volkswagen Golf, it's very popular in Europe for a reason. You can definitely fit 4 adults in the 4-door Golf very, very easily, and they'll be relatively comfortable even on some of those longer trips. Europeans don't seem to understand the American obsession with cup holders. In an American car, cup holders would probably be located in this area right here. And that would mean the shifter would actually have to move rearwards, which is a little bit less ergonomic, but the cup holder is all important in our country. Moving over to the steering wheel, we find some of the controls for the cruise control. You'll find the cruise control accelerate and decelerate buttons over here, resume and cancel over here. There's a voice command button, and then we find a lot of controls back here behind the steering wheel. To the left of the steering wheel, we find a toggle to turn on and off the auto start-stop system and the headlight leveling knob. That's a really nice touch that we find in a lot of European vehicles. Sadly, European vehicles that come to America seem to delete that feature for cost reduction. Bottom line, we have different consumer preferences and different legislative realities in Europe and in North America. And those legislative realities definitely can steer vehicle design in both markets. For instance, in North America, the CAFE standards tend to incentivize larger SUVs and de-incentivize larger sedans. That's why we don't have any 20-foot long huge land yachts anymore. Instead, we have 20-foot long trucks or SUVs along those lines. And in Europe, their legislative realities really have pushed hard on smaller direct injection gasoline engines and other technologies that can really reduce CO2 emissions and therefore also reduce their cost of operation for the average consumer there. It's not necessarily that Europeans like smaller vehicles overall. As you can see in their purchase decisions, the Volkswagen Golf is not the smallest car available, and over time Europe has been getting and buying bigger vehicles overall. In fact, Volkswagen is going to be canceling most likely some of their smaller vehicles while they focus on electrification, and those electric vehicles are going to be a little bit larger than something like the Volkswagen Up or the Volkswagen Polo. Over time, we have seen a gradual creep in terms of overall vehicle size, but it's a little bit different in each market. So in America, sedans have generally become a little bit smaller than they were in the 1970s, but trucks and SUVs have become much bigger because of the legislative realities and, of course, purchase decisions in America. But of course, the bottom line here is that the cute, cheap European vehicles were just not designed for the North American market. Some of them are a little bit too quirky, some of them are a little bit too slow, some of them just aren't the right fit for the North American market. And it's not that some European companies haven't tried. So for instance, Fiat has definitely given it a try with the Fiat 500, the 500L, the 500X, etc. They haven't really taken off the way they thought they might. Other manufacturers have also given it a pretty good try. Volkswagen keeps trying to sell us the Volkswagen Golf, but the Golf does not sell in the same kind of numbers that we see other vehicles available for sale in America. Really, the only sort of European small car that does seem to do well in America is something like the Kia Soul, but the Kia Soul is quite different in North America to Europe. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and let me know if you would buy a subcompact vehicle that's going to cost you $16,000 to $20,000, focuses on relative efficiency, but gives you 0 to 60 acceleration times in the 11 to 12 second ratio. Is that something that the average consumer would be interested in America? I don't really think so, and that's one of the big reasons that we don't see those cars in America. But let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Be sure and find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, and I'll see you all later.